I'm John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. I want to thank you for joining me. Look, I know that for many of you, you are in or about celebrating your holiday season for whatever you faith or whatever holidays you recognize. Um, this show is likely broadcasting on Christmas Day on WBAI in New York City, and the day after in Washington D.C. on WPFW. I greatly appreciate, as I say each week, having the airtime in two of these rather significant markets. But let me address where we're at in the calendar. For one thing, we are still in fund drive in at WBAI, so I do, as always with both stations, ask that you support these radio stations generally, but perhaps specifically for allowing me to be a part of your day or your week, and and for being allowed to be a part of these stations lineup. And it's not just WBAI and WPFW. There are many other affiliates that carry various programs, and when I say affiliates, I mean from the Pacifica Network. They carry various programs from WBAI and WPFW, some of them including carrying this show. So, of course, I also put the show up as a podcast. I put the show up as a YouTube video and as a Facebook video. So there's many ways to watch this. So you may not necessarily be listening to this show on the radio. Um, but regardless of how you get the opportunity to hear this program, I hope that you'll support the radio stations WBAI and WPFW. So let me start off. Let me just give the numbers. If you are listening in New York City, I hope that you will reach out either through their website or through phone, and you can go to buddy.wbai.org. That's buddy.wbai.org. And there you can become a buddy. You can become a BAI buddy in the name of Resistance Radio or any program for that matter. You can also take the opportunity to make a one-time donation or a time donation. There are a variety of different ways you can support the radio station, and if you go online, you'll see some of those options. If you call, and that number is 1-833-922-4692. That's 1-833-922-4692. You will also get a chance to talk to one of our operators to set up whatever means you can support WBAI, whether it's again becoming a buddy, becoming and a sustaining member, um, or making a one-time donation, a time donation, or pursuing some of the other options as far as the way you can make a contribution to the radio station. If you are listening on WPFW in Washington D.C., I hope that you will go to their website, which is WPFWFM.org. That's WPFWFM.org. Or go dial their numbers, which are 202 588 9739, or their 800 number, which is 1 800 222 9739. And it's the same thing. I mean, you can follow the prompts, you can follow the guidance of the operators, and you can make a one-time donation or become a sustaining member of the station there too, um, and hopefully do it in the name of Resistance Radio, and maybe give a mention as you speak or as you make a contribution about your thoughts on Resistance Radio. So. Again, we're closing out the year. WBAI is in its fund drive. WPFW did a week-long fund drive, but essentially, I'm always doing a certain level of pitching for these stations because I greatly appreciate having the airtime and having the opportunity to speak in these two significant markets. All right. Okay, so it's December. And, for many people, the September or December represents a season of holidays, and of course, Christmas, and for Native people, we acknowledge the solstice and certain other parts of nature that present itself during this time of year as well. So, but December's not necessarily festive for everybody. And look, we could talk about some of the tragedies that have occurred recently, or and I'm going to talk about some of the tragedies that have occurred historically on the state. Some that you may or may not be aware of, and some you may be only aware of to a certain extent. And I want to put a finer point on some of this stuff. But I think part of the reason for talking about perhaps tragedy or what other people battle. I mean, look, I had a major loss of a family member. Um, a couple of days before my birthday, December 18th, I lost my son-in-law, who was the father of two of my grandchildren, to cancer. So every December, we go through reliving some of that. So, and I know that people have losses and they have tragedies that that they deal with. There are many people who are suffering with mental health issues, depression, and just the sense of dread that comes with holidays. And I know that seems counterintuitive, but the facts are that many people struggle with holidays. There are many people struggling generally, and the holidays only seem to exacerbate some of the dread associated with their current situation, whether it's depression, whether it's poverty, whether it's homelessness, whatever it is. So um, I just think it's fair to make people aware that not everybody is celebrating the month of December. Now, from a specific Native standpoint, I've got to raise some issues about what has happened to Native people historically in the month of December. And we see all the politics that people are wrestling with in the United States right now, and in Canada for that matter. And oftentimes, what I don't think people realize is that historically, much of the same things have been going on since the birth of the United States and Canada. So, and I think trying to present some of the facts and some of the history in such a way so people are aware that, yeah, we live in a time now that seems so unique and so distinct. We got social media. Everybody's a reporter essentially. People share all kinds of information, but you go back, you go back in time, and the media has always played a significant role in in how the United States, how Americans viewed their standing in the world. And I'm going to get into that a little bit. But before I do that, well, yeah, one of the things I've got to talk about is as we talk about what the United States is doing militarily, whether it's involving Venezuela, or whether it's funding some of the some of the atrocities that are happening by Israel in Gaza and other places around the world. I think you have to put the U.S. military in perspective as well. And for many years, the only conflict that the United States engaged in was conflict with Native people. I mean, after the Revolutionary War, the United States set its sights on Native people, and even as war would break out in the Civil War, there was still an emphasis that was playing out on taking native lands, on m- killing, murdering native people, and I think people lose sight of that. And oftentimes the thing about I talk about siloing because when people think about native people, they think about us in that one area. They don't look at us within the context of the rest of what was happening in the United States. So one of the things that happened during Lincoln's administration was that they passed the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act enabled white people to basically take native lands. And we can frame it any way we want, but at the end of the day, the Homestead Act was about it was about allotting native lands and allowing white settlers. And of course, when you hear white settlers, all of a sudden people think about Michael Landon and Little House on the Prairie. That's not what the settler class was. I mean, settler colonialism was a violent act. And there's no question that imperialism and colonialism was a violent act. And so passing the Homestead Act in 1862 enabled white folks to basically go into Indian country. The United States was making a commitment to pay off Native people for lands, which sometimes that pay either never came or came so late, but diminished the amount of land holdings that Native people had, which sustained them. I mean, look, we could argue whether Native people used land efficiently or not. And arguably we didn't, because that's not the way we lived our lives. We lived our lives uh, in, in, in a free and independent existence that worked with nature, didn't try to control it, didn't try to make the land support us, but allowed the land to support us. So it was a different frame of reference. It was a different ideology, and that was part of the justification for taking native lands. We weren't using it properly. That's what white folks said. We were, the land was a waste if it was only in the hands of native people. So do everything you can to take it. So the Homestead Act really consolidated the areas that native people were even allowed to live, and it took away much of the resources. And when I say resources, I'm talking about hunting and fishing and and again the ability for a larger land holding to support a population. So in the process, native people were forced into starvation. And as a result of that, native people got fed up with it. And so they fought back. They fought back against colonialism. They fought back against settlers. And again, keep in mind these settlers were well armed. They oftentimes had military support. So these were battles. These weren't, this idea of native people just raiding, Michael Landon and his daughters out on the prairie. No, it wasn't that. So what would happen by the time you get towards the middle of 1862, the military has rounded up what they have designated as enemy combatants, and they've got over 300 native people imprisoned. They try them in a military court. So again, keep in mind, this isn't constitutional. This isn't under the normal judiciary. This is the military court trying native people as enemy combatants, and found them all guilty on hearsay evidence, on evidence that wouldn't even hold up in any kind of real court, and sentenced over 300 native people to death. Now, Lincoln was already involved in a civil war. So this is 1862. The Civil War has been already raging for over a year. And so this is complicating Lincoln's life. So he, in the interest of trying to put on a good face for the rest of the world, because the world is already starting to become a bit of a smaller place, you have Lincoln saying, I don't think we can execute over 300 native people. Regardless of what the evidence against them are, I don't think we can do that. So we need a smaller number. So he sends the request, because he had to approve an execution of this size, or perhaps any execution by the military, and he wouldn't do it. So he told the military courts, "You need to get that number down," and they refused. They said, "No, the people of Minnesota and the Dakotas, this area, they are insisting that these people be executed." So Lincoln said, "Send me the information. I'll reduce the number myself." So he did. He reduced the number down to about 38, no, 39 actually. But then one more person had his death sentence commuted, not his sentence, but his death sentence commuted. So Lincoln signed an execution order for 38 Dakota to be hung in Mankato, Minnesota. Now, that execution would take place the day after Christmas. Again, this is the whole thing with December. The day after Christmas in 1862. Now, before I even get into the execution, look, we think about war being this thing that's got rules to it, right? And of course, everybody thinks about the Geneva Convention, and the United States was always big on prisoners of war. How are they supposed to be treated? Well, they obviously didn't live up to any of the standards, even fairly recently with Abu Ghraib. But the idea of just murdering a prisoner of war, executing them, was something the United States could and would do if those people were native. And I say that because, look, I don't know how many people realize, but no one was executed as an enemy combatant in the Civil War. In the Civil War, no one was tried for treason. I mean, you would think that some of these guys, Jefferson Davis and some of the key figures of the so-called Confederate States of America would have been charged with treason. But no, no, they weren't. And no one, look, the Civil War was a bloody conflict. And I'm not suggesting that people didn't die. They certainly did. But the idea of taking prisoners and then summarily executing them, there's no real evidence of that. And I'm not saying it didn't happen, but there certainly was not a court ordered execution of enemy combatants that came out of the Civil War. But Native people? No, you could just execute them. And as I talk about in the next segment, you'll find out just how willing Americans were to accept this idea that Native people should be executed. But so the day after Christmas in 1862 in Mankato, Minnesota, the good people of Mankato came out in their Christmas Day finest to watch a historic event. And that historic event was going to be the execution of 38 Dakota that were going to be hung in a massive gallows. Nothing like this has ever even been built before. So even the engineering feat of creating a gallows that could as hang up to 40 people, but they were going to execute 38 people in one drop of the floor. One drop of the floor, they were going to execute 38 people, 38 human beings. The largest mass execution in the history of the United States. And these weren't people who were tried in a regular court. These were people that the United States deemed as the enemy in a military conflict. And so what did they do with the prisoners of war? They killed them. And keep in mind, the rest of the 300 who were sentenced, who were convicted, they all died in prison too. So this is what happened the day after Christmas in 1862. And there's accounts of it. There's accounts of the Lakota Dakota that were singing a song as they were being executed. They literally sang a death song. The amount of courage is incredible. And each year, I got to tell you, each year there are people who do a ride that tracks the path that these people were marched on to march to their execution site in Mankato, Minnesota. In fact, I used to screen a film called The Dakota 38, and you can find it online, I'm sure. But it's a film that chronicles one of the first, if not the first, I think it was the first ride that these guys had done to retrace the footsteps, the journey that these guys were forced to go on to to see to be executed. And it's an interesting ride. One of the things in the film that is worth noting is that you had many people who were struggling. And so this is a contemporary film now. This is a documentary. It's not a dramatization of it. This is a documentary about this ride, and there's younger people, and many of the places that these people are coming from have been decimated by U.S. policy, poverty, drugs, substance abuse, suicide, all kinds of things, all kinds of just terrible conditions. Some of the most impoverished areas in the world are some of these native territories. That's the facts of the matter. So many of these people on this ride are doing this ride in spite of, and basically doing it, escaping the reality of their lives to do this one symbolic. So these guys were doing this symbolic ride, and they basically took time out of their lives to do it, and their lives that they left behind to do this ride was oftentimes one filled with with a really tough lifestyle. So one of the things that one of the people in the film was a guy by the name of Billy Ray Dumark, and as I showed this film a couple of times in New York, I learned a little bit more about Billy Ray Dumark. So I told people to pay particular attention to him. He was a guy who struggled because among the things that happened on these rides, these historic rides, is that white people are supportive. They oftentimes have people that take them into their ranch and help bed and feed their horses, and they've done some did some prepared dinners for them and that kind of thing. So it was it wasn't necessarily where they were in a constant state of conflict with people along the way. No, they were supported. Even when they got to Mankato, Minnesota, the mayor of town, embraced them and welcomed them and that kind of stuff. But some people, including Billy Ray Dumark, struggled. And I know that some of the producers of the film couldn't understand why Native people were not more appreciative of what these white folks were doing. And see, what they didn't understand is that all of this affluence that these white people demonstrated with their gracious hospitality was affluence that came from the lands that were stolen from Native people. So yeah, some of those Native people struggled with it. And as it would turn out, as you watch the film and you see guys like Billy Ray Dumas kind of come around a little bit and starts feeling optimistic about even the ride, which would be the next year, the subsequent year. And then when the film closes, you realize that he's honored in memorial in a memorialized in the film because he had died. So I did research and I found that he committed suicide. So you get a sense for the struggle that exists on the ground in some of these native territories. And, so even as you watch something like the Dakota 38 and you realize that these guys are trying to commemorate a historic event and a tragic one, that's that's what many people native people go through. And that's why I talk about some of the things that I talk about on the show. So again, let me dial back. 1862, this execution takes place by order of Abraham Lincoln. Now, for those of you who aren't really doing the math or looking at the calendar as I'm talking about this, December 26th, 1862 is 1 week. 1 week before Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. So, again, I feel like when I talk about the execution in Mankato, this largest mass execution in the history of the United States, I've got to put it in perspective. Again, no other enemy combatants involved in one of the deadliest conflicts the United States has ever been in, its own civil war. Nobody was punished with execution. Nobody was tried for treason. Nobody was executed by a court, military court or otherwise. I'm not saying that people didn't die, and I'm not even saying that people weren't executed, but I'm saying there wasn't a court-ordered execution signed by the president for anybody after the Civil War. In fact, much of the Civil War, post-Civil War, would turn into a bit of a conflict that exists to this day, North versus South. It still exists. You still see Confederate flags being flown right alongside American flags, as if flying a Confederate flag is somehow patriotic. So I think it's important to put things in that perspective, that Native people were treated in a much different way than white people who committed much more serious crimes and threatened the entire integrity of the United States. I mean, threatened the entire nation. And yet they weren't held to the same punitive standards that the Native people who were only trying to feed themselves. And again, I can't mention this execution without framing it against Lincoln standing up on January 1st in 1863 and doing this blustering speech about emancipation, which was really more about trying to initiate a stronger slave revolt. Keep in mind, part of the reason the Civil War even took place was because the enslaved human beings were revolting on their own. They were leaving the South as at a rate that was unsustainable, and it was causing a lot of conflict between the North and the South because the North was allowing these runaways to be free. Of course, Millard Fillmore was one of these guys who said, "No, we're gonna allow you to come up north, and even though these are free states, capture your slaves and take them back." And that created a whole other set of conflicts for years to come. But I think it's important to realize, again, the distinct way that Native people were treated in combat, in conflicts, and in the courts even back in 1862. And of course, how that treatment would continue on for decades. And one of the things that I think is worth noting that yes, there there were massacres, Sand Creek Massacre. There were massacres that would take place, throughout native territories, especially in the plains areas, and and it would be devastating. It would be devastating to native people because those they weren't battles. They were literally massacres where men, women, and children, older men, women, and children, were murdered. Oftentimes, even after the battle would rage, like for some of the accounts from the Sand Creek Massacre, talk about shooting children wallowing around their dead mothers on the plains. I mean, this is the kind of thing that took place. So, out of again getting into what December could mean to some Native people, on December 15th, Sitting Bull was murdered. They came to arrest him for what was not any legitimate charge. They came to arrest him, and ultimately they murdered him. That's December 15th, and that's 1890. So a little over almost 30 years after this execution. So Sitting Bull is murdered. That's December 15th. Now, the reason I mentioned the media earlier is because I think it's important to realize that many Americans were always following these stories of the Western frontier. It was romanticized. It was written about. Not only did you have James Fenimore Cooper and folks like that who loved to write stories about Native people and heroize Native people to some extent, but anybody who would print an article, even out west, and that those articles or some of that account would make it to the east. The people in the east, the civilized part of the United States, they love this stuff. So I got to bring up a guy who many people may be familiar with his name, a guy by the name of L. Frank Baum. Now, L. Frank Baum would go on in the future to become famous for writing The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and of course, not only do you get the MGM film The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, but you get The Wiz, you get these Broadway shows Wicked and now the film adaptation of Wicked and Wicked 2. So the whole story that was created by L. Frank Baum just keeps living on generation after generation after generation without really understanding the political nature of the story that he wrote. Because L. Frank Baum thought that native people were evil, but just flat out evil. And if you look at the characters of his story, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, he every one of those characters represented something. The Wicked Witch represented the frontier. The Flying Monkeys represented the native people. The Tin Man represented industry. The mindless or brainless Scarecrow represented farmers. There was all of these representations. The Cowardly Lion, all of these characters represented some political class, I guess you could say. Uh, But I think most people just look at it as a fairy tale. But I say that only because if you go back up into time, before he was an acclaimed writer of this, what most people perceive as some sort of children's story, he was the editor of a newspaper in Dakota Territory. It was called the Saturday Pioneer. And he too could romanticize to some extent some aspects of native life. And I say that because there was this sentiment that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. There was a phrase that was coined by Philip Sheridan, whose statue, by the way, sits in the New York Capitol Plaza, the Empire State Plaza in New York, in Albany, in New York, um, for whatever reason. But they've got this great equestrian statue of Philip Sheridan on a horse. But that's what he's saying it's for. The only good Indian is the dead Indian. But that can be taken two ways. One way is to suggest that the only way an Indian is good is if he's dead. The other way to interpret it is that only the only the good ones died. They've been killed. And L. Frank Baum was of that mindset. He felt like the good Indians were all gone. And with the murder of Sitting Bull, he wrote an editorial, which it's it's almost a backhanded compliment to Sitting Bull in a way, But rather than me try to interpret it, let me just read it. And ironically, this editorial would come out on December 20th, which some of you may recall is my birthday. Um, but it came out many, many years before I was born. So December 20th, 1890, this is an editorial written in the Saturday Pioneer, the newspaper that L. Frank Baum was the creator and editor of. And this is what he wrote. Sitting Bull, most renowned Sioux of modern history, is dead. He was not a chief, but without kingly lineage, he arose from a lowly position to the greatest medicine man of his time by virtue of his shrewdness and daring. He was an Indian with a white man's spirit of hatred and revenge for those who had wronged him and his. In his day, he saw his son and his tribe gradually driven from their possessions, forced to give up their old hunting grounds and espouse the hard working and uncongenial avocation of the whites. And these, his conquerors, were marked in their dealings with his people by selfishness, falsehood, and treachery. What wonder that his wild nature, untamed by years of subjection, should still revolt? What wonder that a fiery rage still burned within his breast, and that he should seek every opportunity to obtain vengeance upon his natural enemies? The proud spirit of the original owners of these vast prairies, inherited through centuries of fierce and bloody wars for their possession, lingered last in the bosom of Sitting Bull. With his fall, the nobility of the redskin is extinguished, and what few are left are a pack of whining cur who lick the hand that smites them. The whites, by law of conquest, by justice of civilization, are masters of the American continent, and their best safety of the frontier settlements will be secured by the total annihilation of the few remaining Indians. Why not annihilation? Their glory has fled, their spirit broken, their manhood effaced. Better that they die than live the miserable wretches that they are. History would forget these latter despicable beings and speak in later ages of the glory of these grand kings of the forest and plain that Cooper loved to heroism. We cannot honestly regret their extermination, but we at least do justice to the manly characteristics possessed according to their lights and education by the early Redskins of America. Again, December 20th, 1890. So this may not have been the New York Times of its time, but this sentiment not only went out in the press, and it did get shared. It did get shared to the East. Because, again, as I said, there was this romantic notion about what Native people represented. And again, keep in mind, what L. Frank Baum is saying here is, now that Sitting Bull is dead, they're all the good ones are gone. Or at least the ones that warrant any kind of respect. So they should just exterminate us. Now, what did extermination mean? Look, the idea of running, tens of thousands of people through gas chambers to execute them in that way was not established. Look, there were other ways that Native people were killed through the spreading of smallpox blankets and massacres and scalp bounties and everything else. But this is a newspaper person who would go on to be one of the most famous authors in the United States, who was calling for the extermination just because it was the only way to secure their settlements, because they had wronged us. And he acknowledges that they had wronged us so much that the only way they could secure the future of American settlement was to exterminate us, to wipe us off the face of the earth. That's literally what he says. And of course, I use this piece that Baum wrote when I talk about mascots. I mean, you're thinking, well, what does this have to do with mascots? Well, this idea that we should be wiped off the face of the earth because we were despicable, and that if they did so, then they could reinvent us. And they could speak, what's this line here? They would speak History would forget these latter despicable beings and speak in later ages of the glory of these grand kings of the forest and plain. That's what mascots are. A complete erasure of what white folks thought of Native people. Yeah, there was a certain romanticizing of who and what Native people were. That's why you had guys like L. Frank Baum who thought that that Sitting Bull was a noble savage. But once you can erase us, now you didn't exterminate all of us, but you erased us enough in your history books and in American consciousness that now white people could say, you know what? I want to emulate a Native person. In spite of the way we treated them, I want my children to play Indian as a part of their high school and their grade school education. So the idea of erasing that the true history and then hoisting us up as these grand kings of the forest and plain, as Baum talked about, is what the mascot issue is. That's why I specifically cite this piece from L. Frank Baum, the one that calls for our extermination. Because you can't have the conversation. You can't talk about extermination from, at least from an L. Frank Baum standpoint, without talking about what his bigger and or loftier goals was. He believed that by exterminating us, they could maintain our manly characteristics in their history books. That's what he says. And the part that really sucks is that he's right. They did that. They maintained this notion of noble savagery, I should say, to the extent that, except for certain animals, Native people are used as mascots by kids and adults. Colleges use them. Professional teams use our imagery. This idea of this fierce, noble savage. They liken sports to these massacres without ever really explaining the fact that we were the ones who were massacred, with the exception of Little Bighorn and a few other places, Red Cloud and Osceola, who put up great resistance. They don't talk about that in history. So even as these schools and these school boards fight like hell to maintain this notion of using us for their mascots, they won't teach the history. They don't even teach the history of what did make us a noble savage. They don't even go there. But I think it's also important to realize that this was written on December 20th of 1890. This is before the massacre at Wounded Knee. When did that massacre take place? 9 days after this. So, was the U.S. military following the advice of L. Frank Baum? I guess we'll never really know. We'll never really know whether those generals or those commanders or whatever you want to call these guys in the military, these officers, whether they're influenced by this or not. But the fact of the matter is, after the murder of Sitting Bull, this editorial comes out. 9 days later is the massacre at Wounded Knee. And essentially, it's the last one. It's the last official military massacre, I guess, is the only way to describe it, of Native peoples by the U.S. military. 1890, and people refer to it as the bookend of the Indian Wars, because the idea of doing these mass casualty events against Native people was no longer tenable. Morally, it was never morally tenable, but they thought it wouldn't fly very well. I think there was a certain American, sentiment, again, that romanticizing of Native people, that was becoming problematic when you looked at this. And the crazy part is, L. Frank Baum wrote another editorial after the massacre at Wounded Knee. It wouldn't come out until January 3rd of 1891. And it was condemning the massacre, but not because of the loss of life of Native people. Let me read. I'll leave it up to your interpretation. And you can find these online. If you want to search Baum or L. Frank Baum's genocide editorials, you can find it. It's easy to find. That's how I printed these off. But here's what he wrote on January 3rd a couple of days after the massacre at Wounded Knee. The peculiar policy of the government in employing so weak and vacillating a person as General Miles to look after the uneasy Indians has resulted in a terrible loss of blood to our soldiers. I gotta stop here. The massacre at Wounded Knee was like shooting fish in a barrel. I mean, they literally had these old men, women, and children surrounded, and there's no evidence that any soldiers were killed by Native people, but there's pretty good evidence that Native people or that soldiers died by the wrong crossfire. So the loss of life at the massacre of Wounded Knee was mostly self-inflicted. It was friendly fire, and again, there's not a whole lot of evidence that suggested that there was really much resistance put forward by the Native people. I'm sure there was some, but most of those who died from their own mismanagement, and that's what Baum is talking about in terms of General Miles. There's been plenty of time for prompt and decisive measures, the employment of which would have prevented this disaster. The Pioneer, the newspaper that he's writing in here, has before declared that our only safety depends upon the total extermination of the Indians. Having wronged them for centuries, we had better, in order to protect our civilization, follow it up by one more wrong and wipe these untamed and untamable creatures from the face of the earth. In this lies the future safety for our settlers and soldiers who are under incompetent command. Otherwise, we may expect future years to be full of trouble with the redskin as those have been in the past. So Elfer and Baum wrote this editorial to condemn the massacre because their own men died, some of their own men, and it was a completely asymmetric situation here. The loss of life to U.S. soldiers was minimal compared to the over 300, and there's oftentimes an effort to downplay that number. Over 300 Native people were executed, essentially executed in this raid. So again, I've got to talk about the distinction here. No general has ever been court-martialed or somehow punished for the crimes committed against Native people. Not in the Sand Creek Massacre. That's Shivington, who basically coined the phrase "nits make lice," which Hitler would adopt later on. That was his justification for killing children. And while he was condemned, he was never charged. And nobody here was charged either. So that's what takes place in December. The largest mass execution in the history of the United States. Right at the the front end of the Civil War. An execution that would only take place because the enemy combatants were Native, because no white enemy combatants would ever be executed as a result of the treason committed in the revolt that caused the Civil War. And of course, you have this. The largest or the last massacre. I don't even know if it's the largest, but the last massacre that the United States would engage against Native people in 1890. I mean, it's worth noting that 1890 is not that long ago. I had a grandmother that was alive then. So it's like, for people who will suggest that I dwell too much on the past, I think it's worth noting that much of the policy that could justify this kind of oppression, these kinds of atrocities and heinous crimes committed against Native people, this kind of genocide, still exists today. And that's why I talk about this stuff. Look, we weren't citizens of the United States in 1890 or in 1862. We weren't. We were regarded as a distinct people right from the beginning of the United States. The Constitution specifically excludes us And even after this, after the Civil War, after the abolition of slavery, and the 14th Amendment that would essentially grant citizenship to the formerly enslaved, or impose, it would declare citizenship upon the formerly enslaved. We could argue whether it was a gift or whether it was a curse, but regardless, even the 14th Amendment excludes us from this notion of birthright citizenship. And I'm not saying this as a complaint, I'm saying it to point out the distinction of our people, Native people, versus U.S. citizens, or those that would be declared U.S. citizens in 1865 or 68, the 14th Amendment anyway. As I sit here today, I've said this on previous shows, I not only reject this notion of being a U.S. citizen, I also reject the notion of being a lawful permanent resident of the United States, because I'm sitting here right now on the territory of the Seneca Nation, which is not a part of New York State or the United States. It is land that is held by the Seneca people. So I don't live in the United States. I'm not a lawful permanent resident of the United States. I'm a lawful permanent resident of the Seneca Nation. So with these ICE raids and everything else that's going on, what does it mean if somebody comes to me? Am I supposed to claim to be a U.S. citizen just to avoid conflict? Those who know me would know I wouldn't do that. If an ICE agent were ever to, and I'm not suggesting they're going to be on my doorstep here, although my wife still worries about it sometimes. If an ICE agent were to stop me off territory in particular, but even if they decide to come into Seneca Nation territory, and I was questioned about whether I was a U.S. citizen or whether I was an undocumented person, I would say I've got plenty of documentation about who I am and what I am, where I was born, and everything. But I will still maintain that I'm neither a U.S. citizen nor a lawful permanent resident of the United States. So what are you going to do? Deport me? To where? I'm native. I may not be Seneca, but what are you going to do? Deport me to Mohawk territory? See, there's no box that we fit in quite, very comfortably. And therein lies the problem. We never fit into the box, even when they drafted the Constitution. There was a problem. And the problem was that we weren't a part of what the United States was building. So when we talk about things like colonization, is colonization a war? I would argue it is. So those who resist it to this day, are we enemies of the United States? Well, look, I have some serious problems with the United States government and state government and Canadian government and provincial government. But I've never declared war on any of these. But if you believe that our communities, even today, are somehow U.S. colonies, because look, when people think about settler colonialism, they think about the white settlements that exist. Well, where does that leave the rest of us? Where does that leave those of us who still live on native lands? Regardless of federal funding, which are oftentimes the result of debt that the United States has towards native people, regardless of this imposition of citizenship, or this definition of native people as tribes, bands, or nations of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States, that's your words. That's not ours. We never say that kind of stuff. Now, we may be some of our people may be complicit with some of these things, citizenship, subordination, being regarded as wards of the federal government. We may be complicit with some of that. And it may look or appear that we've accepted it, but not all of us have. In fact, if questioned, almost none of us fully accept any of that stuff. But it's the world that we live in around us, right? So yeah, right from the beginning, when colonists came, we engaged in commerce. We engaged in the commerce that you were pursuing. So when people say, "Well, you use money, don't you?" We've always used some sort of commerce amongst native people and amongst Europeans. In fact, in the U.S. Constitution, when in the apportionment clause, they referred to how you would count persons would enumerate the people of the United States for taxation and for representation, for how many congressmen there would be. And what they did is they counted the enslaved people as three-fifths of a person. Now, they weren't three-fifths of a citizen, but for the purpose of counting their bodies for congressional representation, especially for the South that had very little white population but a whole lot of black population because of the slave trade. They wanted to make sure they could get some sort of credit for the people that they owned. But in the Constitution, they said, well, we're not going to give you the full credit for them. We'll count them as three-fifths of a human being. But in that same apportionment clause of the Constitution, they say excluding Indians not taxed. So what does that mean? I mean, people say that. Well, does that mean we're not taxed? Look, we were taxed. Although there were native people who were already engaging in commerce with settler colonialism. And some of those people were no longer living on native territories. They were getting involved in the fur trade. They were getting involved in other trade goods. So there were native people, there were quote unquote Indians who were participating in U.S. commerce or in the commerce of the colonies. So the way they would distinguish those of us who weren't a part of the United States from those who were kind of coming in was to refer to the rest of us as Indians not taxed. That same reference was made in the 14th Amendment, almost 100 years later. So this notion that the United States could recognize a population that shared the continent with them as a people distinct from them was nothing new. The problem is, well, then what box do you put us in? And what their courts did at some point in the early 1800s decided that we were no longer independent enough to be regarded as sovereigns. So Chief Justice John Marshall decided that we were domestic dependent nations. And he created this notion that we were like wards of the state, that we were like under the guardianship of the United States. And so they create this false narrative about the United States being our trustees, and we as a people, and I mean 1,000 distinct peoples. I mean, the only thing I had in common with my ancestors had in common with people on the West Coast was the fact that we were on the same continent and that we predated the existence of the United States and that we were regarded in their U.S. Constitution as being excluded from their Constitution for both taxation, enumeration, but arguably, the enumeration clause flat out says we aren't even a part of the Constitution. That's the interpretation that makes the most sense. And when they passed the 14th Amendment to declare that the formerly enslaved were now U.S. citizens, they made a distinct point to exclude us once again. And that exclusion, again, it's not a slight. It's an acknowledgement that we are a different people, that we are not Americans. We are not U.S. citizens. And we would not be U.S. citizens as a result of the 14th Amendment. Now, 50 or 60 years later, they would pass a law to finally put this box around us. They would pass the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924. 1924. We're talking about the 20th century. They passed a law declaring that we were citizens. But nothing in this idea of declaring us citizens would deprive us of our property, of our personal property, or our tribal property. I don't know what the hell that's even supposed to mean. What is the sale of my labor? Is that not mine? Is my labor not something that I own? So, am I subject to federal income tax? They argue that we are. We argue that we aren't. So, I bring up all of this stuff in the month of December because the month of December just almost exaggerates the treatment of Native people, both with the largest mass execution in the history of the United States, and with the last massacre that the United States perpetrated against Native people, almost at the turn of the century, 1890. And these things are the December. These are what December is known for people like me. And of course, I can't leave out the writing of a guy who would become this iconic author of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, L. Frank Baum. And by the way, L. Frank Baum is from central New York. Yeah, he's from a little town called Chittenango, New York. They actually have yellow sidewalks in Chittenango to honor L. Frank Baum. So this is a guy who knew who we were. He knew that Native people were civilized. He was aware of the Haudenosaunee. And if he did any historical research himself, he would know that guys like Ben Franklin were envious of our ability to form a union. Our ability to form a union. But by the time he's out in Dakota Territory, writing for this newspaper that he built in Aberdeen, he would regard Native people in such a loathsome manner as to call for our extermination. And whether the massacre at Wounded Knee came as a direct result or was even influenced by his writing, who knows? But what I do know is on December 20th, he calls for our extermination. And on December 29th, an extermination takes place. An extermination of over 300 older men, women, and children at the hands of the U.S. military. So it's funny. I last week I listened to the program that precedes this program on WBI, and they were talking about that during World War I, when the enemy combatants, basically sung hymns together and maybe even played a little bit of football or soccer, as they called it. They shared cigars and that kind of stuff. So you had the Americans and Germans who were at war with each other, made peace for a couple of days. Well, isn't that nice how white people can treat each other? White people can actually wage war against each other and just kiss and make up afterwards. The Civil War took, by some estimates, between 500,000 and 700,000 lives. The Civil War did. This was a war of treason. There was treason committed by the South to destroy the United States as it was configured at the time. Yes, it was secession, but it wasn't just secession. There was war. This wasn't just a separation. This was a bloody conflict. And no one was executed as an enemy combatant. But 38 Dakota were during that war. During that war, while the United States is completely engaged in a conflict that would only last for 4 or 5 years, they would still carve out time to try over 300 Native people, sentence them all to death, and ultimately execute 38 of them. And then a couple of years later, they would round up 2 more. So when anytime you hear people talk about the Dakota 38, you oftentimes hear Dakota plus 2, or 38 plus 2, because it's 38 that were hung in Mankato, Minnesota, and 2 more that would be hanged later. So part of the whole idea of doing this program was to make people aware that while you're enjoying yourselves, and I'm not telling you not to enjoy your holidays or whatever your traditions are during the month of December. I'm just trying to make you aware that it's not always a festive occasion for everybody. Many people struggle during this time of year. And Native people who relive some of this history, yeah, we struggle with it. We struggle with the whole notion of peace on earth and goodwill to men. We struggle with this idea that the country around us can have so many homeless people and then sing about a baby being born in a manger because his parents were homeless, and build an entire religion around that. So I'm not suggesting people shouldn't enjoy any time of the year. And for me, as I mentioned last week, I had a birthday, so my new year, my new trip around the sun began on the day of the solstice. I know that others, share this time of month. Reggie Johnson's birthday is a couple of days before Christmas, so I wish him a happy birthday on. I'll do it right now on air since Reggie joins me. Basically, Reggie joins me for both this program and because this program airs in Washington, many people have become familiar with him. So while many of us may have reasons to celebrate the month of December, there are many of us who don't. There are many of us who struggle with this whole idea of it being a joyous month. So that's what I wanted to present here today. That's what I wanted to present as perhaps an alternate narrative to what people normally hear during the month of December, and so that's what I've done. I want to remind people that we are listener supported radio, and we greatly appreciate your contributions to both WBAI and to WPFW. Let me close the program by once again reminding people, if you go to the website or to the phone lines for WBAI, you can go to Buddy, that's BUDDY .WBAI.org, and follow the prompts to make a donation. Or you can call 1-833 922 4692. Look, if by chance you dial the number and you get an answering machine, just leave your name and your number and a good time to call might be helpful, and somebody will call back at your convenience and take your information to make a donation. If you are listening in Washington D.C., you can go to WPFW's website, which is WPFWFM.org, or you can call 202 588 9739, or their 800 number, which is 1 800 222 9739. And of course, you may catch this program as a podcast. You may catch it as a video on YouTube or on Facebook. So you may not necessarily listen to us on the radio, but however you manage to pick up this program and learn a little history on this day, I hope you'll still support the two radio stations that air us as a program. And if you listen to us on an affiliate of Pacifica, I hope that you'll support those affiliate stations as well. I will remind people that this is Resistance Radio, and I want to thank you for joining me. Yahweh.